So this is Baelin's basic belt bag. And if you follow these videos, you'll be able to complete a bag from start to finish. Bless Baelin very much for making this bag pattern available for anyone. So first off, our bag that we're showing in the videos, it's made of Talbev's signature duck cloth canvas.
Because it will be going on Talbev's kit.
Super basic. Here's the patterns. You just print them out and then you lay them out on your fabric. And what we're showing here and talking about is that you can secure them to the fabric or you can mark out how you do them in different ways. You have your straight pins. Yeah, see, there's our little straight pin. And yeah.
I personally tend to use a real light spray adhesive and attach it that way because as we've discussed in prior videos, straight pins and Baelin don't get along.
Or you can use chalk. I find that chalk is super handy for duck canvas in particular, and I like to reuse my patterns. And straight pins, sometimes they tend to like pull the fabric up a little bit, but this is such an easy bag to make. And I did cut it out using a circle cutter. So you're gonna have one of each of these patterns. None of these are doubled unless you're making two bags, which makes it super simple.
Now here you can see, holding the circle cutter, it's a smooth motion and you'll go through the fabric. No problem.
Mm-hmm. There's lots of ways that you can mess up with the circle cutter, so just be careful. You can cut yourself super simple. It is a razor blade in a wheel format. I'm about to demonstrate.
You can stab your material very, very hard, and
Don't do it like me. That was a bad example, but we included it to show you one of the ways not to hold your circle cutter.
This is the pizza cutter that will cut through you. Not speaking from experience.
I have cut myself a few times and I still don't seem to learn. So look, super easy. Dun, 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 dun. And I'm going to trim that edge. Our patterns have seam allowances. We'll get into that. That's the distance between the edge of where the fabric is and where you actually will stitch it. But you can kind of get a really good view of our seam allowance here. So now once you have everything cut out, you kind of want to get an idea of like what they're going to look like. These particular pieces, these 4 particular pieces are actually the walls of the bag. And you see they come together to make the sort of the box shape that is the signature of this bag. So I like to kind of like mock them up beforehand. Now here they are. I'm showing you the seam allowance on your sewing machine on your foot. So that line that Baelin so beautifully designed in his pattern here is where the needle would punch through, and you can line it up. And I'm showing you that depending on your sewing machine and how you measure it with your foot, that's where you'd want the needle to punch through the fabric.
And you can maintain that same seam allowance throughout the entire bag. So as Talbev did here, it's good to identify that seam allowance, what it is on your machine in advance, not trying to figure it out on the fly as you're going through. Otherwise, that's when you're going to make a mistake.
Now, I like to reuse my patterns. If you're printing on regular paper, you can actually, most machines will punch through the paper, but I would recommend you don't do that. And you will go ahead and reuse your patterns. And again, if you doubled up your cutting to make two of these bags so that they match on each side of your body for symmetry, then you're gonna want to save your patterns so you can maybe cut more later. So again, I'm following that seam allowance. I am a bad example. I don't like to use pins. But the nice thing again about this pattern is that it's super easy. I mean, these are not complicated stitches that we're doing here.
No, not at all. And again, you also have a lot of experience with sewing, and your sewing machine in particular. For those of us that don't sew as often, use your pins or your clips.
So I oversew. This is what I'm showing you in this clip here. Is I tend to oversew and use the back stitch. this bag will take a beating.
Needless to say, you can't just hem and haw your way through this. You want to make sure that these seams will hold up, and you got to stay on point with all of this. Sorry, are these really bad dad jokes?
So here's that same pattern that that we showed you, but here it is assembled. So the four sides of that sort of like base square of the box. Now it's inside out. If you didn't realize that, if you've never sewn before, understand that you're looking at it inside out.
So once you sew, as you just saw, clip the corners. That's going to help with when you start attaching the floor panel or the bottom panel.
Yeah.
She's showing there.
Yep. If you clip the corners, that makes it less fabric, and it also makes it so that when you flip it right side out, you get that nice squared off bottom. There's a bunch of different techniques on this. I'm showing you the easiest one. Like if you already know how to sew, you're going to probably be like, well, I do it differently. And that's okay. That's one of the great things about this particular pattern is that you can do a ton of stuff to customize this bag, to make it more to your style. I'm showing you in most of this video the easy way to make these bags so that anyone, regardless of their skill level in sewing, can create it.
And that was the goal when I came up with this pattern, was to make it as basic and as simple to make as possible. It was designed with the simple stitch in mind.
Yeah, and again, it's kind of about knowing your machine and knowing like your fabric that you're using and knowing your thread you're using. I did this really quickly. I whipped out the entire bag in less than an hour, and that's from start to finish. And I did it with the idea that anyone could sort of take what I was doing. So what I'm showing you here, this is fun to do voiceover work, Baelin, to like critique my own sewing. But
what I'm doing here is critical.
It is actually critical. Let me see. There we go. I'm showing you that the corners can be clipped again after you sew each side. Now, when you put the bottom of your bag on, you're not necessarily going to want to sew it. How to describe this? I think
you don't want to sew it in a circle because you're going to end up with a circle that won't fit in the bottom.
Yeah, to give it a squared off. Yeah. So you want to sew long, long, short, short. That's exactly how you want to sew it to get those nice squared edges. Because again, this is a square or rectangular, but you know, squared off edges. Rather than accidentally curving your edges and then your bag becomes a pouch, not a nice squared off bag as you saw at the beginning.
It will affect the structure of the bag if you don't do it this way.
Yeah.
So long, long, short, short.
Long, long, short, short. And it's just one of those things. And again, clipping those little corners, Baelin made the pattern with curved edges, but I was like, you know, if I didn't know how to sew and weren't, you know, real precise, I would just leave them squared off. So I wanted to show, again, sort of that entry-level sewing to this. So because I didn't cut them in a curve, you have to nip the corners real thoroughly to make the bag go square, if that makes any kind of sense.
Absolutely. And in general, it makes more sense to clip your corners, again, just for when you do that tuck at the end, when you turn it back right side out and you get that nice flush bottom.
Yep. And that was the goal. And you see that I'm having to kind of fight with the material here. Don't be afraid to do that. Take your time, kind of push, move it out of the way, do what you got to do to make it line up comfortably. Understanding that, you know, this is part of sewing, is that you are negotiating and navigating with all the fabric you're doing. What I like about this bag is how much it can teach you, because it's not very big, but it's still enough material where you kind of got to wrestle with it to get it to line up, and you kind of, I mean, that's part of the learning process. Yeah. Look at all this. I am critiquing my own sewing. So again, if you know somebody who sews, I would recommend that, you know, you're going to have to do it on your own. I would ask your aunt, your grandmother, your grandpa if he sews, I don't care who. I think getting hands-on help is going to help you. more than these videos maybe, but we're trying to make it so that anyone can sit down in front of a sewing machine and give this a go. We want people to learn. We want this pattern to be something that they can just pick up and make it to fit their kit and fit their plan.
It's meant for the beginner to make a bag that looks good and looks like it belongs on a kit. This is not a hard to do. The hardest part is going to be fighting with the fabric.
Oh man. Okay, so I think we're getting, yeah. So what I'm doing is I'm actually wrestling with the corners. You couldn't see it very well, but I was wrestling with that fabric, and that's that point I was saying, is that like I didn't want the bottom of my bag to bow in or out. I wanted it nice and straight. So you saw my arms like yanking. I was yanking it to make sure that it was nice and flush, so that the bag, and literally this bag will stand on its own. We had a good giggle when I showed it to the regional commander. He was laughing at it because I stood it up in front of the camera and it stood completely on its own. And that's the nice thing about this stitch and this construction. So yeah, see, I'm wrestling with it and I'm cutting the corner. When you're using duck canvas, you're using a highly structured fabric.
And that's, especially for what this bag is intended for. This is, going to hang off of your belt. It's going to be, this is your wallet. This is your pocket while you're at a con. And so you want something that's structured and that will take a beating, as was mentioned earlier. You want something that you're not going to lose whatever you put in here, as we discussed in prior videos, like with the running stitch, where this would tear. You want to use that back stitch to make sure that the bag has the structure and will hold up to what you're going to put it through.
And this is what I'm doing here is I'm making sure all of my corners are nipped, because that's the other thing you're going to want to do. See, I showed you. I nipped the corners so that when the bag is folded right side out, here we go. Dun, dun, dun. So when the bag is folded right side out, that the fabric, the little nipped corners, lay on top of each other and don't bunch up. That's what I'm saying about getting a nice squared off bottom rather than like a bulged bottom. See how it became sort of like, oh yeah, of course. I'm fussing with it. It is duck canvas here. But you can kind of see that it actually looks more like a box and not a pouch. And I think that's one of those fun not challenged challenges. Now in this particular bag at the end, I did use the running stitch to do a finishing stitch, and we'll talk about that. But you see how they're nice. I didn't iron this. All I did was use my hand to like really fight with it. And I didn't use any tools. There's a lot of stuff you can do to really make punch these sort of angles out to really square off the bag. So here's the top edge of our squared off bag. And we did a running stitch and then we rolled it over one to do a second running stitch on top of it. That gives you a nice finished edge. Now, here we are starting the flap and the belt loop. So you have the top of the bag and then you have the flap. Now, Baelin designed this so that you can adjust the flaps to point in different directions when you finish this off. But what?
If you want to, you can have the flap facing different directions on each hip, or if you want to do multiples of this bag, you can have them alternating.
It's extremely flexible. You can even maybe change like on the flap, you can maybe even change the angle. You should always iron the flap part flat. I did not. Don't judge me. I cheated. I cheated and I did a running stitch because I was trying to do this quick and dirty. So I did a running stitch and then I did a finishing stitch on it at the very, very end. And I like sewing the seams on, like when you're talking about a flap or something that's going to be on top of a bag, because this is not load bearing. This is for looks, this part. So again, this is all about how you want your kit to look. So here you are. I attached them together. You can iron it flat, and then I did a running stitch on it. So I actually did bust out the iron a little bit when I did the flap. Again, this is kind of quick and dirty. You might consider bias tape or other ways you want to make this fancy, but for learning purposes, you roll it over the seam allowance and you just give it a good iron. And this is where you use a running stitch. If you follow our videos, everyone knows how I feel about those.
Yes, but running stitches have their purpose in doing decorative stitching or top stitching, not for structure stitching.
Yeah. So here we are actually sewing it. Again, that seam allowance is super handy, and knowing your sewing machine and knowing your foot keeps a consistent seam allowance. So this would be the underside of the flap in the top, just for people who are trying to understand spatially what they're looking at. This part will be hidden. So we did the same seam allowance on your belt loop. Again, you're gonna have kind of some raw edges, but that's okay. And you should iron that. I'm just lazy.
But the point is, you fold it over in half, and you can adjust the length of the belt loop for your belt. But this principle is going to be the same. You're going to line up all your edges there on the bottom with that top flap and the belt loop, and then you're going to attach those together.
Now, I did do this with a running stitch. I'm pretty sure this one I did with a running stitch. And I think, yeah. So the reason that I did this with a running stitch here was that I wanted it to hold it in place so I didn't have to actually use safety pins or to pin it. And it doesn't hurt to have a little bit of extra stitching before I attach it to the bag. Because when I attach this to the bag, I'm going to do a running stitch and then a zigzag over the top of it. Again, I tend to over sew. So just something to keep in mind about my style of sewing. And there it is.
The attachment to the bag is probably one of the more important stitches on this bag. Mm-hmm. When you attach that belt loop to the bag itself, because that is going to be the single heaviest load-bearing stitch. Mm-hmm. So if you overstitch no other stitch or no other seam on this bag, that's the one you want to oversew.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly the one you want to oversew. So in this video, I've already attached it via a running stitch, just to show you. So it's already been sewn twice now, and then we're going to do a zigzag stitch. And what I wanted to show you here in particular is, again, for load-bearing purposes, you don't want to start your running stitch where the fabric of the belt loop and the top meet the bag. You want to start before that. So look, see how I'm backing it up a little bit? See, that helps with that load-bearing quality, so it can bear more weight. So here we are, we're going to zigzag stitch it together. And again, you're asking your machine to go through a lot of fabric here. So you want to kind of like make sure that your stitches are how you want them. And nothing says you can't, do a heavier gauge stitch here, maybe a different thread. This is kind of up to you. This is the nice thing about this Baelin's basic belt bag, is that it's super customizable. But again, on the other side, you're going to want to run past where the loop and the top meet the bag, just to give it a little bit more oomph. So there you have it. You have it mostly together. I did these finishing stitches, which is just running stitches along the front in a U shape to match the running stitches that were on the flap and the belt loop. And I think it kind of gives you like a nice sort of finish to your bag. It gives it more of a squared off front look. What do you think, Baelin?
I think they are fantastic, but again, they're optional if you're not comfortable doing it. Not required.
No.
I personally agree with you. I like the way it looks. I like the added structure it gives.
Yep. And I didn't do it in the back because this was all about sort of like, that is a cosmetic stitch. Now, the fun thing about this belt loop, Baelin talked about it, and I'm going to talk about it again here. Depending on the size of your belt is how tall you're going to want to make that loop. I just threw it on there as part of like, let's see how quickly we can do this. But I wouldn't recommend that for most people. But I did pull out my 2-inch belt. This is not my real Mando belt. This is just to show you. This is a 2-inch belt, and I threaded it through to show you how it would hang. Now again, you would want to adjust that based on the belt you're actually wearing. So from start to finish, this project was under an hour for me, and I had never looked at this pattern. I had never touched it. I'd never had anything to do with it. And Baelin literally just left it here at my apartment. Oh, I wanted to tell you, you can close it with magnets. Earth magnets can be glued to duck cloth really, really nicely, and then you can actually have a nice closure for your bag. That's what I was showing you. Perhaps Velcro, it's entirely up to you.
There you see the bag standing on its own.
Well, I think that one's leaning, but it will stand on its own. I've showed it in a few videos standing on its own. I love the squared off front look for your Mando.